Okay, all right. So we're up to 60. I think we'll kick off. So as I said, yeah, I'm Mark Frost. I'm the current chair of the Transport Planning Society, and I always find it's useful to go back to the founding of the society. Not start right from the very beginning, but TPS was founded in 1997 as a society to facilitate, develop, and promote best practice and innovation in transport planning, and provide a focus for dialogue between all those engaged in it, whatever their background. And I love that. Yeah, it's a really excellent objective for the society. It's broad, and it's still as relevant today as it was in 97. And considering that sort of key point around supporting dialogue, whatever your background, I think this event fits really nicely within that objective. Obviously, this is one of a number of Transport Planning Day 2021 events that we're doing this year. Transport Planning Day, which is a campaign that we've run for the last 5 years, is intended to be an opportunity for the sector to come around together and explore a particular issue. And for this year, our theme for Transport Planning Day is equality, diversity, and inclusion. And we've been exploring that through a whole raft of different events and blogs and thought pieces that the society's been putting out over the last few months. But we are ramping it up now as Transport Planning Day is approaching on the 15th of November. You can register for Transport Planning Day on our website now. We have an excellent lineup with senior officers from the DFT, from a variety of different consultancies, and Lord David Blunkett giving his reflections on his experience, both travelling around the place and also being very senior in government for many years. So for the purposes of exploring this theme of equality and diversity and inclusion and how it relates to the sector, we've tended to structure it into 3 different areas. So we've looked at who we are as an industry, and in particular diversity issues across transport planning. Spoiler, we could do better, I think, is the answer to that one. Secondly, who we consult with and then who we engage with when we are discussing our work with the public, and how do we invite them into our decision-making processes, and how do we hardwire equality considerations into our technical standards. And this is very much about issues such as tactile and inclusive mobility, both of which are currently being reviewed by the DFT. So this section around qualities impact assessment, I think, fits really neatly into that second category. How do we engage people in our decision making? Our last event that we had, the last one that I chaired actually on the 13th of July, we considered specifically community engagement techniques and how best to bring the public into scheme design and decision making. And Brogan, our excellent compere from PTRC, will drop a few links into the chat for some of these previous sessions if you want to revisit them. And moving from that very broad discussion about wider community engagement, we're going to take this in a notch and look specifically at how we consider the issue of engaging people who fit within the protected characteristics as set out in the Equalities Act 2010. And of course, this is very important because it is a legal duty upon us to do so. And many people have come unstuck by not doing this, or indeed not doing it very well, which I shall touch on in a minute. Just as a sort of quick reminder to everybody, there are 8 protected characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex or sexual orientation. So those are the legal protected characteristics, and it's the population groups that fit between those that we must give special consideration to when we're progressing any public sector decision, be that a strategy, be that a policy, be that a revenue scheme, be that a capital scheme. These are the things that we must take into account. You'll notice that I didn't mention income there, and this is something I've been looking into a little bit recently as some work that I've been doing. And so income is not a protected characteristic in England, but it is under the socio-economic duty in both Scotland and more recently Wales. So in both areas, you must consider socio-economic matters, but not in England. Now, obviously, socio-economic does fit sometimes within the other protected characteristics, particularly when you're considering ethnicity, for example, but it's not an explicit characteristic and protected characteristic. So it's an important nuance there. But as we are a nationwide, indeed even international society, there are nuances that apply to other nations of the UK. So those are the protected characteristics. However, it's important to bear in mind what we need to do with them, and that what we need to do with those protected characteristics and people that fit within those is set out in the public sector equality duty. And that obliges all public agencies or those working on their behalf to work to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, and other conduct expressly prohibited under the Act, more detail in the legislation. Advance equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristic and those who do not. It's quite nuanced, lots of room for interpretation in that. And foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who do not. Now, this is a really topical area for a number of practitioners, and I count myself in this light, particularly given the sort of the more recent and rapid changes that have been made to the public realm in response to the pandemic. Many of which, and particularly in London, have had legal challenges raised against them. And I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of every legal challenge, but all of the ones that I have been involved in, and indeed have seen, have cited equalities impacts as part of the grounds against the scheme or the intervention that had been progressed, and they were suggesting there was some breach of that public sector equality duty. Now, sometimes that's quite specific. This scheme did not consider the needs of people with mobility impairment, and therefore it is it is illegal, is the phrase that's often used, perhaps not quite entirely correctly. Sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced, and it comes back to that fostering good relations point. Did this scheme foster good relations between people who are mobility impaired and people who are not? And certainly the conduct of people in some committee meetings that I've been into, you'd say probably no, it didn't foster very good relations. So it's quite it's a broad area here, and it's rich pickings because there's a lot of subjectivity for legal minds and people that are bringing claims against authorities. And there are significant consequences. I mean, probably the one that most people know about, and it was most highly profiled, was Justice Lang's finding at the beginning of this year against TfL, brought by the Licensed Taxi Drivers Association and I think 2 other groups as well. And that was specifically about a scheme that was on Bishopsgate, but it pulled in the whole of the street space guidance. And there was a range of different findings from Justice Lang, but one of the key ones was that the equalities impact assessment, in particular for the Bishopsgate scheme, was inadequate, which is a very strong ruling for a judge to come to, particularly given the context that impact assessment had been developed in the heart of the pandemic, and it has now been overturned at appeal. But nonetheless, the points made are very relevant and do bear consideration by practitioners. But practitioners are often sort of just left to get on with this stuff. And there was a great comment, actually, I think, Lucy, on one of the LinkedIn posts that I saw from Richard from Southwark. I don't know if Richard's with us tonight. But he says, this is such an important aspect of schemes and one that people ignore at their peril, absolutely. But it's great to see some specific training in an area that many professionals will feel that have just been left to get on with it in recent years. And I think that's absolutely, I mean, that's certainly my lived experience. I think many others. This is a really difficult area of work. It's very emotive, can get very personal very quickly, and without the right training and approach and expertise and experience, it's a real minefield for practitioners. And so I'm really pleased that we can do this event today and talk through some of the really positive approaches that we can do to make that a bit easier for practitioners, but also to make the whole thing more useful, and also particularly to help further diversity and inclusion and the ability for people with those from those protected characteristic population groups to get involved in our decision making. So, right, that's enough from me. Across our 3 presenters, we have a wide range of experience and expertise in the sector. So what we're going to do is 10 to 15 minutes from each presenter. Then we'll have a few quick questions, anything that's come up in the chat in particular, then on to the next one. And then we'll call everyone back into the virtual room for a bit of a panel discussion at the end. And then we'll look to wrap up. I think we've got a couple of hours in the diary for this, but if we end up finishing a bit earlier, then that's fine. We'll see how long the conversation goes on for. So to start with, I am very delighted to introduce Katie Pennick, who is the campaigns lead for Transport for All. Transport for All is the only disabled-led group striving to increase access to transport and street space across the UK at the current time. Katie leads on the organisation's campaigning, policy, media and influencing work. Transport for All believe passionately that disabled people should be able to travel with the same level of confidence and freedom as everybody else. Building on the spirit of their roots as a direct action protest group, they're now focused on systems change, devising campaigns that are strategic, data-driven and impactful. They make change in a lot of different ways, from influencing policy through stakeholder engagement to raising public awareness with successful media campaigns. And their groundbreaking Pave the Way report remains the only in-depth and independent research of the impacts of low traffic neighbourhoods on disabled people, and certainly a body of work that I became quite familiar with and found quite useful. So without further ado, Katie, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me. Okay. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Grant. Yes, so as Mark said, I'm the campaigns lead at Transport for All. I'm going to be talking about really the importance of EQIAs and why it's so important to get this right, and the impact that has particularly on disabled people and our ability to access the built environment and access our local communities. We do a lot of work with local authorities. Actually, we actually offer quite a lot of consultancy and training ourselves, and we do a bit of disability equality training, and we do some sort of EQIA guidance and best practice. And this is going to be a sort of very condensed whistle-stop tour of a bit of strands of work that we do in that kind of training. So Mark has very wonderfully introduced Transport for All and what we do. Two very key kind of principles that we work on. First of all, is that we take a pan-impairment approach to everything that we do, which makes us quite unique from other disability organisations in the UK that typically tend to be sort of one impairment focus, so looking at the needs of, for example, blind and visually impaired people or wheelchair users. But we represent the interests of all of our members across all of the impairment groups. And that's really, really important, which I'll come on to a bit later. We are also very much driven by the social model of disability. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to the social model for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The social model is a way of thinking about disability. So the main idea is that you are not disabled by your body or your impairments or anything going on with the kind of individual, but by society and the barriers that exist within society. So for example, I'm a wheelchair user, but I'm not disabled because I'm a wheelchair user and because of, me not being able to walk. I'm disabled because of the barriers that exist in society, the lack of ramps, for example. And it might sound a bit semantic, but it's really important because it shifts where the problem lies. It shifts it away from being with the individual and discussions around what is wrong with a person and their body and or mind. It shifts it away from the individual and being more about the world and the collective society and the barriers that we create. And it's in direct contrast to the medical model that says you are disabled by your body, saying that the problem of disability is with the individual and therefore the way forward is to kind of cure or erase the impairment. The social model, in contrast, says that the problem is the barriers, and so the way forward is to remove the barriers. And it's really important that we make this distinction, the premise of this being that we are all only as able as society enables us to be. And it's important to keep that in mind, because just as we as a society have built this world, built the built environment and created all of these barriers that exist and disable people, that means that we too can also remove them, that we have the power to remove them, but also the kind of social collective responsibility to do so. And an EQIA really is a tool to help do that. It's a tool to help with making decisions, not only to avoid creating negative impacts, but actually to create positive change and to remove the barriers that exist. And so we take a pan-impairment approach to everything that we do. Disabled people is a huge, large, vast group of people with all different needs, all experiencing different barriers. So it's important to remember the kind of range of barriers that exist. People with mobility impairments may experience barriers with the physical environment, thinking about steps, curbs, narrow spaces, uneven surfaces. But blind and visually impaired people may face barriers with a lack of or inconsistent tactile paving or street clutter. Deaf and hard of hearing people will experience barriers of communication, so either with staff or passengers, or with information being kind of presented audio only. Chronically ill people may experience barriers to do with rest, not being able to use benches or alcoves to rest, experiencing long walking distances, either the bus stop being too far away or a car park being too far away, and may also experience particular barriers around social distancing and the need to social distance. And neurodivergent people may experience barriers to do with kind of confusing, disorientating layouts and or signage, and also sensory overload with noise, smell, bright colors, overcrowding. And it's also important to remember that many disabled people experience multiple impairments and are kind of experiencing an amalgamation of all of the above. So as Mark kind of laid out in the introduction there, in sort of the response to the pandemic, about a year and a half ago, we saw many significant changes made to the street space, and these were really done and implemented at pace really quickly. And we completely understand the reasons for that, but we saw that many of the kind of usual engagement and consultation processes that we would usually expect to see weren't being done or weren't able to be done. And we also found that the impact on disabled people of low traffic neighborhoods and of traffic calming measures was not being understood and not being kind of properly identified. And so in response to that, we undertook research, our Pave the Way report, where we interviewed 84 disabled people in London and across the UK about who all lived within a low traffic neighborhood, about their experiences. And we identified a range of impacts. There were positive impacts for some disabled people that were really great to see. So, reduced noise leading to reduced sensory overload for neurodivergent people, reduced traffic danger, more pleasant journeys, improved physical and mental health, which was really, really good to see. However, unfortunately, these benefits could not be enjoyed by everyone due to the kind of existing barriers that existed to active travel. And so for those who could not access the benefits, there were also negative impacts, some of which I've identified here: increase in journey time, increase in money spent on petrol or fares, and a perceived increase in traffic danger as well. And a common thread throughout all the participants we spoke to was this lack of engagement, and the lack of the EQIAs, which is something that cropped up again and again in our interviews. As part of this research, we also had quite a few meetings with various local authorities across the UK to try and get a sense of what engagement was being done, what the challenges were with writing EQIAs. And it was really clear to see the kind of disparity in different approaches and different resources, and a lack of knowledge, a lack of training, a lack of understanding about what they should be. So we've identified a few things that EQIAs should avoid doing. First of all, not being done at all. So any kind of change to the street space or any transport policy, you should be asking yourselves, does this policy affect service users, employees, or the wider community? Is it likely to affect people with a particular protected characteristic differently from the rest of the population? I would say that any change to street space is going to affect disabled people because our options for travel are so limited that we tend to be disproportionately impacted by changes. An EQIA should not be too general, and it should be scheme specific and detailed, sufficiently detailed. So we saw examples of EQAs that had been written for sort of clusters of projects, which were quite high level, quite top level, and quite generalized, and would sort of approach a cluster of projects which comprised of lots of different interventions, traffic calming measures, relocation of bus stops or car parking, school streets. And these are all very different schemes that would have very different impacts. And if an EQIA kind of covers too large an area, it can miss out on really kind of crucial local detail. An EQIA should not be written to justify a decision that's already been made. So if a decision has already been made, money's been spent, work has begun, an EQIA risks becoming a bit of a tick box exercise, and in those situations would have really little scope to impact the outcome. And along very similar lines, it shouldn't be done at the last minute. So a very similar issue is with timescales. If an EQIA process has begun too last minute in the lead up to a scheme launching, again, it will have very little opportunity to actually impact the design of that scheme. And there are fewer opportunities to modify or even kind of change your mind at that stage. It does not propose mitigations. So good EQIAs will identify potential impacts on disabled people. And so obviously the next stage is about mitigating those effectively. It's really important to propose mitigations and to ensure that those mitigations are both practical, achievable, and will mitigate the issue at hand. And an EQIA finally should not be written without input from the people about whom it is written. So disabled people really are the experts in our experience, especially, thinking locally about specific areas and routes. And so disabled people will be able to identify potential impacts that you may not have picked up on. So what about good EQIAs? What should an EQIA do? It should start out as a blank canvas. So as opposed to starting out with a very kind of concrete plan in your mind about a decision and then writing an EQIA to justify that decision, it should start out as a blank canvas, as a question. And this ties very closely to timing as well. EQIAs must be done at the start of the process, so before any kind of concrete decision has been taken. So think about the mindset that you are going into the process with. Are you thinking, we are putting a low traffic neighborhood, for example, in, how do we mitigate the impacts? Or are you thinking, and do you have the mindset of, we are considering making this area a low traffic neighborhood, what impact could this potentially have? And upon balance, should we do it? An EQIA should be detailed and very specific to the scheme that you are writing the EQIA about. So look at the context of the area. Are you introducing this policy near, for example, a special educational needs school? Are you near a hospital or other kind of medical practice? What is the demographic of the people who will be impacted? The local residents. What journeys do people make? What accessible options are there? Are you talking about implementing a scheme in a neighborhood that has no step-free tube station? What are people's alternatives? What are you changing? Are you introducing any physical barriers? Are you altering the street space? Are you relocating a bus stop or removing a parking space? And what else can be done to improve the overall experience of accessibility in that area? Something we saw a lot of when LTNs were introduced were LTNs being put in, but then no kind of improvements to the accessibility of that surrounding street space, which was a kind of missed opportunity. It was sort of discouraging car use, but then there would still be the same old problems of the lack of drop curbs and inconsistent tactile paving. So looking really closely at that area will really help with that. EQIAs should absolutely involve disabled voices via accessible engagement. So disabled people will be able to identify potential impacts. An online portal alone is not sufficient because disabled people are kind of disproportionately represented in the number of adult internet non-users. So it's important to have kind of different streams of collecting that feedback. Information should be jargon-free and easy to understand, and ideally be presented in a range of accessible formats. So thinking about producing things like large print versions for physical kind of handouts, looking online, making things available as text-only documents or static HTML, which will be accessible to screen readers, whereas PDFs aren't. thinking about producing easy read versions for people with cognitive impairments, thinking about producing British Sign Language translation, like video formats, and then thinking about the actual engagement itself, trying to gather as much detail as possible. We work with local authorities facilitating focus groups. We do walk/wheel arounds of the particular area and intervention. We can sort of produce tactile mock-ups of particular built things. And just finding ways to ensure that you are gathering feedback from as many different people as possible, and ensuring that your feedback is representative of people of all the different impairments, and you're not just thinking about people from one particular impairment group. And then finally, acting on the actions. So based on all of the impacts that you have managed to identify and taking into consideration the mitigations that you have proposed to mitigate those impacts, you have 3 options. The first is to continue with the project as it is. The second is to continue, but with some alterations. And the third is to stop the project altogether. And initiatives that will have significant negative impacts on those equality groups, for which no actions you can come up with will mitigate against those impacts, should not necessarily go ahead. So that's a very, very whistle-stop tour of equality and impact assessments and the importance of them. As I said at the top, we deliver training and services with more information. So if you're interested in any of that, do get in touch. And I'll hand back over. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. So I've got a question specifically about a question here. Towns and cities looking to improve the environment for pedestrians, cyclists, and bringing in strategies and consultations regarding improvements. But something that might not have been considered in enough depth is the need for accessible blue badge spaces within centres, and I assume that means town centres. Is there any guidance on the maximum distances expected for disabled people who are reliant on either blue badge spaces or taxis to enter the centre? So I think there's a specific question there about facilities for blue badge parking in town centres rather than sort of EQIs more generally. Is that something you've come across before? I know there's some stuff in inclusive mobility, but I don't know if it goes into enough detail, and it's literally just about to be reissued, I believe.
I don't think I have off the top of my head a figure for the minimum distance. Is that what that is? The distance a blue badge should be to the door of a centre?
I think possibly sort of between each other and between, you know.
So
you can sort of say,
I see. Oh, I see. Between blue badge. Again, I don't have that figure off the top of my head. But when talking about minimum clearances for walkways, we always go with 2 meters is the ideal minimum width for pavements. 1.5 it should be the pinch points if we're talking about bollards, and then I think 1.2 is like the absolute minimum. Yeah. But again, you mentioned the inclusive mobility document that was back in 2005, so that desperately needs updating. It does,
and it is on its way. And I think we'll actually find out more about that at Transport Planning Day on the 15th of November when we have Emma Ward.
Very exciting.
Seamless link there, and terrible plug. And looking, I've got a question here from Ian Price asking about equalities impact assessments for strategies. When you've got a strategy which probably sets out a whole host of different measures and interventions and policies, and you've got to do an EQIA across the whole piece. You know, are there any good examples you've given of how that's been managed? Because particularly in what you were saying about EQIs being done on specific schemes. Any thoughts on that?
Again, I'm not sure. I don't have any good examples to illustrate that, but I think the same sort of principles apply of ensuring that it started as soon as possible, and I suppose trying to be as specific as you can, looking at the potential impacts of that strategy.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in my experience in practice, you can do a reasonable EQIA on a strategy on the basis of predicted impacts across different protected characteristics. But you kind of have to caveat to say, when we do a specific scheme, we will do further analysis about what that impact is. Lucy, did you want to say anything on that? Particularly how you go from a qualities impact on a wider strategy and plan through to an individual scheme? Lucy, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, you're in. You're in now. You're in now.
Sorry, I didn't have anything particularly to say about it. No. Sorry, I was just trying to sort out the lighting in here, so my mind was on other things. Yeah. No. You mean how you go from from a general like a transport policy that an authority might have into a specific design? I mean, ideally, I suppose those bigger policies layer down into detailed design at the end of the day, and they should inform what we build. But often there are barriers between the policy and what we end up building that mean that doesn't happen.
I can give, I mean, I know what we've done is, Collins, hi everyone from London Borough of Islington. So I know at Islington, we recently consulted on a transport strategy, which is a huge overarching document. It is definitely, I think, much more challenging to do an EQI on such a huge document that is, talks about public transport, talks about cycling, talks about walking. It just covers so much ground. I think just on a practical level, the way we approach that is looked at the intersection of all the different types of road users intersected with all the different protected characteristics. So we looked at, so if we were looking at disabled people, we'd look at disabled people who walk and think about the impacts of the policy on them, disabled people who cycle and the impacts of the policy on them, and just kind of flesh it out that way, which led to a very, very long document, which I'm happy to link and share in. But I think it's at least a helpful starting point to really think through the impacts of each of the policies specifically and the different themes of policies on all the different users. So for example, moped users and motorbike users have very different needs and impact as a mode, but then if that's intersected with different protected characteristics, for example, age, it might have a different impact. So it's a really long document. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think it is really important to dig down and not try and make big general sweeping generalizations. That this policy will impact all people in this way, because I think the purpose is to really look at specific users with a focus on those with protected characteristics. So that's how we do it, but I'm sure there's lots of ways to do it, and there are lots of examples.
It sounds really comprehensive. If you get a chance to put the link in the chat, actually, I'm sure people would look to that. There's a couple of questions here that I'm going to leave for the panel, actually, because they go across all the presentations. But there is one specifically here, I think, actually, Katie, you might want to reflect on. Do disabled people get to ask input on too many schemes? I mean, certainly I found this when I was in practice in a local authority, that it was often the same people you end up contacting. I've just got one more. Could you just have one more? And it was a bit painful. What's your experience here? What's sort of best practice?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I can speak from lived experience as well, because I'm very often asked to kind of input into particular things, and it could be a full-time job. And I think there are two things. I mean, our model for best practice is about how you value disabled people's both time and expertise. And so we really, really encourage, where possible, to provide kind of financial incentives to value people's time. So providing payment or vouchers or whatever that kind of looks like for what you're expecting people to do. If that's kind of doing a kind of 3-hour walk around of a specific area, that needs to be kind of compensated. But it's also another reason why it's so important to be engaging and doing an EQA process on something as specific and zoomed in as possible, because you can find disabled residents of a particular area who will most likely be quite willing to and have a lot of opinions to express about something that really impacts them, that it's literally on their front doorstep, and why we are less about doing those kind of really like zoomed out EQIAs on and as you say, like getting the same like very vocal people to comment in on the same things. So, but you know, it's a very good question, and I think it's finding that balance between the onus always being on disabled people to kind of quite exhaustingly rehearse and discuss our lived experience about things again and again and again, and but then also providing that opportunity for engagement. I absolutely understand that that is a difficult line to tread, but I think there are some examples where it's really important to ensure that people are having their say.
Yeah, I think we might come back to this actually specifically in relation to trials, because I think that's where a lot of people have slipped up this year, because typically when you're doing a big consultation, you get these views in and you can do something pretty robust with those. But when you're just going straight headlong into a trial, that's where I think that some of these gaps emerge, and then where particularly some people have come unstuck this year.
Just another thing on that is another reason why it's important to, if possible, start the process as early in the kind of whole process as possible, because I think what can be very frustrating for disabled people is taking part in, you know, focus groups or consultations or whatever, and then you sort of discover, you know, at some point in the middle of a conversation that, you know, the point at which you've been brought in to comment on a particular scheme, actually by that point the bulk of the decisions have already been made, and there isn't much scope to influence the outcome, and that can be so disheartening and so frustrating. I've definitely experienced being brought into consultations, and my first comments have been like, you know, there's a step, I can't get into that train, and it's like, oh well, we can't really change that, but do you like the pattern? And it's very difficult to you know, that becomes even more exhausting. So giving people an opportunity to meaningfully influence the outcomes of a consultation, I think goes some way to making that more attractive.
Yeah, no, I completely see that. Loads more comments on the chat, which is grand about that. Thank you very much, Katie. So we'll move on to our next speaker now. So this is Lucy Marstrom-Tuasig, from the technical lead from Metis and Transport Planning Society board member, I should say. Metis is a consultancy providing highways design and sustainable drainage expertise for Transport for London and a wide range of local authorities. Said she's a board member of Transport Planning Society. She co-chairs the ICE's Active Travel Community of Practice, is a member of the Department for Transport, Cycling and Walker Infrastructure Group, and was on the DfT's Expert Steering Group for the National Cycle Design Guidance, local Transport Note 120. She provides policy and design advice on low traffic streets, walking, cycling and road danger reduction to authorities across the London and the UK. And she's also written a number of really interesting articles about this subject. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Lucy. Over to you. You're still on mute at the moment, Lucy Egg.
Sorry, just looking for the mute button. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Mark. So that was a fascinating presentation, Katie, and kind of a precursor in some ways to what I'm talking about, which is thinking of things, I suppose, a little bit more broadly, but with a particular focus on children. In many ways, children, their voices rarely get heard. We are supposed to consult with children in an appropriate way. So local Transport Note 120, the most recent cycle design guidance, advises local authorities to consult with children and young people. I guess they're a group that don't have a voice. They can't advocate for themselves. And so in many ways, I feel that they deserve particular focus and attention, because their needs have been rather overlooked. So there is a focus on children, but it's also just looking more generally at some of those protected characteristics that Mark mentioned at the beginning. So there are, I mean, a lot of equality impact assessments understandably refer to the Equality Act, but it's also worth mentioning that there are a couple of other acts that I think relate to equality impact assessments. One of them is the Education Act. So the Education Act states that local authorities have a duty to promote the use of sustainable travel and transport to schools. So it relates particularly to children and their carers who are likely to be accompanying them to school. And the other one is the duty under the Health and Social Care Act to promote health for all. And again, we know that streets have significant impacts on health one way and another, and the way they're designed has a major impact on health and well-being. So Mark highlighted earlier all the protected characteristic groups, but I've drawn out 5 here. The first is age, so that would be children, but it also could be older people who need particular consideration. The second is pregnancy and maternity. Disability, I think Katie's done an excellent job of kind of outlining that in a really coherent, understandable way, actually. The other is race, because there's some studies showing that, for example, cycling potential might be higher with some ethnicities than others. So race can have an impact, and also sex or gender. So I think those are the ones that I wanted to focus on, partly because we've got data on the different types of trips made by some of those different groups. And if people are making different types of trips, we know that that's going to have an impact on their ability to use the streets and the streetscape. So we've talked a bit already about disability, but there's obviously these other characteristics, and there's a lot of overlap, I would think. So if you have a street which is accessible to somebody using a cycle, maybe as a mobility aid, we've got this photo here of Isabel Clement from Wheels for Wellbeing, so using a cycle as a mobility aid. Arguably, if somewhere is accessible for a mobility aid, it's also going to be good for a cargo bike, and good for these other types of cycles that people might be using either to carry children or goods or themselves around. And clearly children and young people are covered by the Equality Act. So there's this kind of duty to consult with them, which again is often rather overlooked. I think partly because it's quite a difficult area. Maybe authorities don't have experience of consulting with young people, and the methods that are needed are different. So they need to be clear, but and you need to access those groups. So it might be preschool, it might be nurseries, it might be schools, but they're particular groups that authorities should be going out to consult with. We kind of often think, I think, when we're drawing up equality impact assessments, about the physical infrastructure, because it poses these very visible barriers. So we've got this example here, again, I've taken that from the Wheels for Wellbeing website, but where you've got 2 railings too close together, and somebody really struggling to get through there. The other kind of quite visible impact of infrastructure, or a car-dominated infrastructure, is casualties. And I think that's something that certainly needs considering when you're looking at equality impact assessments. And I'll talk a bit more about how we should be thinking about casualties. There are also these hidden impacts of transport policies, which they're important because they have different effects on different groups. So, for example, pollution, we know, impacts babies, fetuses, pregnant women, and young children far more than it does middle-aged people. So it has different effects on different people. Climate change, again, it's kind of largely going to be shouldered by the next generation, but children do not create CO2 in the same way that adults do. So there are different impacts as a result of these transport policies and the way we design things. I think in some ways, women and children, because they're not a minority, we forget that their needs might be very specific. So, for example, when we're thinking about children, their most frequent trip type is going to school or a place of education. And just as there are differences between the genders. So, for example, women make 4 times as many escort education trips as men do. So they're much more likely to accompany their children to school. And if you're travelling with children, or if you are a child, the needs and the way the street is designed needs to be different from if you're travelling as an independent adult. And people have different preferences. So we know studies are telling us that older people and women have a stronger preference for separation or protection from motor traffic. and particularly at junctions and intersections where you're more likely to get casualties. If you're travelling with children, that need for protection is even greater. But there are significant gaps in research. So a lot of an EQIA may end up being guesswork, because we don't really know, for example, can a child use a pedestrian refuge, and at what age can they use it safely compared to perhaps a zebra crossing? So there are gaps in research which I think do need filling for us to do really good EQIAs. I put this chart together as really to illustrate the impact of increased motor traffic over the decades. So on the left-hand side of that chart, that's you can see there it's 1970, and you've got about 95% of children. So children are indicated by the red line. That's children walking or cycling to school independently at primary school age. So in 1970, 95% of kids went to school by themselves at primary school. And by 2020, it's dropped to around 2%. And it's almost mirrored exactly by the increase in motor traffic. So we know that the main reason parents cite for not allowing their children to move independently is fear of motor traffic. It's not fear of stranger danger or other things. That is an issue, but it's not the main reason they'll cite. And yet there's this huge kind of potential. So most primary school children want to cycle to school, or rather half of them do, and only 2% do so. But this is just, I mean, I suppose, you might be thinking, what's this got to do with the quality impact assessments? But I suppose the issue is that there are kind of needs and desires for independent travel, and we need to re-enable that amongst children. In a similar way, I think, Katie, you talked about enabling disabled people to use their own environments, and it's a similar argument in a way for children. And on that note, we have, you mentioned the social model of disability, but I would also argue we need a social model of vulnerability. I mean, this word vulnerable road user gets bandied around a huge amount in transport planning, and it greatly concerns me, because it's that, exactly as Katie was talking about, the focus becomes about the person and what's problematic about the person and what's deficient in the person. And actually, if you look at this image of these children, they're perfectly, there's no deficiency there. They're perfectly able to play and be safe on their street because of the way the street is designed, because there isn't the threat of motor traffic. So it's these external factors which pose and cause the vulnerability rather than anything inherent or innate. So yeah, I'm fairly uncomfortable with the term vulnerable road user, for the reason that Katie stated in a way for the disability thing, is that it focuses the attention on the wrong thing. It doesn't, we need to be thinking about what is causing the vulnerability, what is causing the disability. So I suppose this thinking is beginning to creep in a little bit into our policies. So this is an image I took a few years ago, actually, of a child being unable to cross to get to the refuge in the middle. This image is in Local Transport Note 120. And in it says that uncontrolled crossings are not suitable for everyone. So there's a kind of recognition that if an authority puts in a refuge or an uncontrolled crossing, it may not be suitable for everyone, and therefore, by definition, they are not going to be meeting their duties under the Equality Act. So yeah, there is a bit of, I think, a gap in research. So we know that motor traffic injuries are the leading cause of death for children aged 5 to 14. But that children and teenagers, and I put in inverted commas, lack perceptual judgment to cross busy roads. Arguably, why are we having these busy roads in areas where children live that they can't use? So it's not a deficiency in the child, it's the fact that we're putting them in circumstances which are not suitable for human life. So UK highways engineering demands behaviours and skills outside of the cognitive, developmental, behavioural, physical or sensory development of the youngest in our society. So we're giving them environments which they are unable to use because they're children. So yeah, the kind of that thinking of, rather than thinking about the victim or the person who's got the problem, can feed through into the way that we analyse casualties and road danger. And there has been quite a shift, I think, in recent years, about, rather than looking at, say, you know, was the child wearing a helmet? Was it a child? Were they travelling at night? Did they have lights? You know, or looking at all these potential defects in the person who's been run over, it actually says, well, hang on, let's look at the vehicles, let's look at the drivers, let's look at who's posing the danger. So I put this in just as a way to, I suppose, if we are thinking about equality impacts, it's not just the person who's unable to potentially move around, but looking at the impacts and the unequal impacts posed by different modes and different types of driver. So I included this because I find this quite interesting. This is from TfL's Vision Zero Action Plan, and you can see there that highest bar is for motorcyclists. So motorcyclists involved in fatal and serious injuries for people walking. So basically, motorcyclists pose more danger to people walking than other types of driver. Well, that kind of again poses a tension, because we tend to lump motorcyclists in as vulnerable road users, but actually they pose substantially higher risk per kilometre to other people on the road. So I think, yeah, the way that we analyse danger and casualties is really important, because it affects what we're actually doing in the way we're thinking about things. I think low traffic neighbourhoods are such a, they're such a kind of source of thought as well as contention, but they raise so many issues. And I wondered, yeah, I just put in this question, does less motor traffic mean the space is more or less equal? You know, what we know that if you remove motor traffic, we'll get more people walking and cycling, because the threat of motor traffic has been largely removed if you remove through traffic. And there's this really brilliant study by Anna Goodman looking at some of the low traffic neighbourhoods in South London. This is one I photographed in Southwark, but you can see there this huge range of different types of people by age and gender and ethnicity actually moving through that space. So in that top photo, 23%, well, not in the photo, but in that scheme, they've got 23% of people cycling are children, which compares to the national average of 2%. So by removing traffic, we've suddenly opened up that space and enabled a whole range of ages to use it. But there is, and I just also captured that photo of somebody in a mobility scooter also suddenly being able to use the space safely. But arguably, if somebody is dependent on a vehicle, it makes it less accessible. But it seems like low traffic neighbourhoods really encapsulate a lot of the questions that we have as a society at the moment in terms of how we remove traffic, what are the impacts. I mean, the great thing about them is they can be trials, so you can actually analyse and measure some of the impacts. Mark mentioned the legal cases that have referred to EQIAs, and I just was looking at the Bishopsgate case. So the TfL EQIA stated that blue badge holders, taxis, will not be able to pass through the bus gates. But conversely, for those accessing the area by foot, cycle or bus, it's expected that access will be easier as a result of reduced motor traffic. So there's this kind of dual impact on different groups, and potentially there's a lot of overlap between those groups. And the initial ruling in January 2021 was that, as Mark mentions, Justice Lang found that TfL's EQIA did not meet the required standard and it was inconsistent and irrational. That was then overturned by the Court of Appeal, and they found that actually it wasn't perfect, but it was at least adequate for you know, given the circumstances and the COVID and the fact that they didn't have a huge amount of time to go into huge detail for this EQIA. So they said that in fact it was recognised and reasonably well defined. The impacts were recognised and reasonably well defined. Second case that's referred to EQIAs is Shoreham. So West Sussex have been held to account by Cycling UK that they have not considered the impact of removing this cycle lane, which they put in as an emergency measure under the COVID changes. And they haven't properly considered the impact that removing those measures would have on young people, pointing out that age is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. So the Equality Act is being used both for and against removing traffic. It's being used for and against protected cycle routes. So it has quite a key part to play in the law, and I think this ruling is quite significant. Other things that might have an impact on EQIAs in the future, one of them is there's the Cycling and Walking Investment Strategy 2, and a report out recently from the All-Party Parliamentary Cycling and Walking Group. And what they're saying is actually they'd like to see the development of national targets for mobility justice in active travel. So they're saying we're not quite there yet with those targets, but that really we should not just be looking at levels of people walking and cycling or driving, but actually the range of people who are managing to get out there and do those modes. So for example, disabled people cycling or children cycling. And we should have targets set for those groups. The other thing that they mention is linking national and local active travel targets to net zero, so that those targets might be legally binding, because net zero is legally binding. And again, that potentially has quite significant implications for equalities. And the other thing that I think will have an sort of impact on how we think about road danger and transport more generally is the Highway Code. So there are proposed changes. The principle of harm is being introduced, so that those in charge of vehicles that can cause the greatest harm in the event of a collision bear the greatest responsibility. And again, that may well have implications for how we write and analyse equality impact assessments. Yep, that's about it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lucy. A really thought-provoking journey through some of the other protected characteristics, and I think some that maybe don't get the level of attention that they need. I mean, I think that point there about whether low traffic is does that deliver equality outcomes? And I think you kind of touched on this, is it that it's a sort of caveated yes, it depends. In some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. And the craft of all of this is how a user takes into account the varying impacts on different groups. And I mean, I don't know whether you've come across some particularly good examples of those sorts of trade-offs, and how an organizer, I think we'll hear from Ira in a second from their experience in Islington specifically on this, but whether you've come across any really good examples of that in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think Southwark are doing some interesting work, particularly because it's being so well analysed by a group of academics. So I think I certainly would keep an eye on what's going on there, because they're measuring not only the kind of reductions in traffic, but also the increases in walking and cycling, and who is doing those things. Clearly, if you're very dependent on driving, it is going to be, you may have a longer route to go around to get to where you want to get to, but the cycle is a mobility aid for other disabled people, so there's a tension there even within the disability groups. I imagine there's some debate and argument between disabled people, and obviously disabled people may well have children who they also want to be able to cycle freely with them. So yeah, I think things aren't that clear cut.
Actually, Katie, I'd like to get your view on that, but I'll bring you in after we've had Aya as well, and because I suspect we'll touch on that a little bit in your presentation, Aya. Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. So to our final speaker for this evening is Aya Collins. You've got some sort of 70s look going on with your camera there. It sort of looks like it's half plugged in. I don't know if that's something, you're pulling it off, but it's just so you know, it's a bit fuzzy. So Aya is the head of transport projects and people-friendly streets at London Borough of Islington. She's an urbanist with with a passion for just cities and striving for transport decarbonisation. She's got 6 years experience in smart cities technology, urban planning and transport programme delivery. And she's currently driving the People Friendly Streets programme at Islington, working on a programme of low traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, cycle lanes, and of course delivering their ambitious transport strategy, a link of which she's posted in the chat. Islington won a Sustainable City Award for Trailblazing Public Sector Organisation in 2020, and is the current leader on the Healthy Streets scorecard, following it's a prestigious position that. Healthy Streets scorecard following the delivery of LTNs and school streets in 2020. I can also say that she was a very close runner-up for Transport Planner of the Year. I don't know if you knew that, Aya, but there you are. You were. Right, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. And yes, apologies. It is a very retro look. My camera clearly does not do well with nighttime. So I hope you can all see me enough. And I've got this very green banner at the bottom I can see, which just appeared, which I think you'll see in my presentation shortly. It does kind of match the Islington green quite well, but it's not intentional. I mean, just to start by saying, just thank you so much to the other two presenters. You know, I've known about both of you. I've really paved the way very closely. I've heard Lucy speak before, and I'm already learned so much being here today. So I really hope that you all have too. And I mean, my presentation is very much focused on kind of what we've done at Islington. You know, I know this event is kind of about best practice. I think that this is an area in which you just constantly need to be iterating and improving and improving and improving. I think there's no such thing as a perfect EQIA. I definitely don't think ours are perfect. But I'm, you know, happy to share what we've done, because hopefully it's helpful to some people. And, you know, and you can learn from it, and also really happy to take back feedback and ideas on how we can do better, because I think that's what we should all be trying to do. Yes. So what is People Friendly Streets? So that's what we at Islington have called our COVID kind of transport response that started last year at the start of COVID. So in May, we kicked off with People Friendly Streets. It's a program of low traffic neighborhoods, pop-up cycleways, and school streets. So, you know, I hope the low traffic neighborhoods gets people talking. That's really what I'm going to focus on today, because it's kind of been the biggest, most controversial aspect of what we've done. But just to flag, we have also done 22 new school streets. Those are those little squiggly lines on that map of Islington on the right there. And the big purple areas are the low traffic neighborhoods. So 23% of the borough is now in new low traffic neighborhoods. This was kind of all start to finish. We had no low traffic neighborhoods at the beginning of COVID, and have really delivered them all as part of our People Friendly Streets program. And then Mark already did our accolades, so I won't repeat those. But yeah, we're really happy to be recognized for the work. It's obviously been across London and across the UK. The delivery of low traffic neighborhoods has been amazing to watch. So I do just want to emphasize, you know, that we've done things very differently as part of People Friendly Streets, and I know this is something many boroughs and authorities have done before COVID. I think especially for low traffic neighborhoods or livable neighborhoods or mini Hollands, the standard approach was kind of a very long period of early engagement, co-design, consultation, and then a final decision. So throughout my presentation, you're going to see me refer to resident impact assessments, or RIA. That's just what Islington, but that's what we call our equalities impact assessments. They're the same thing, I guess. It does touch on, you know, I know there was some discussion around income and if that's included as a protected characteristics. Ours do all of the standard protected characteristics and income. But they kind of look at all the different protected characteristics. We just call them resident impact assessments, but it's the same thing. So hopefully that doesn't confuse anyone. So, so normally we would kind of, all of the early engagement and co-design and consultation would feed into that resident impact assessment, which we would do as part of the decision making and prior to the decision being made to inform the decision. During COVID, I think we, you know, got central government guidance, but also felt it was very important with the borough. We have 70% of households in Islington don't have access to a car. There was, I think, a well-founded fear that if just some of those people who relied on public transport switched to buying cheap, very polluting cars, we would have gridlock on all of our roads, which would be a huge crisis. So there was a need to kind of implement stuff very quickly to make walking and cycling safe alternatives to public transport while people were avoiding it. So we wanted to deliver low traffic neighborhoods very quickly and school streets. So we kind of flipped the model a bit and instead implemented things under experimental traffic orders. And then we're doing consultation now. We're in the midst of doing consultation. And then we'll make a final decision. So they're implemented as trials, kind of living trials that you live in. Just want to emphasize, this isn't our preferred model. I think it's much better to do more early engagement, more co-design, more consultation, take people along. I think we'll revert back to that now. It does take longer, and there's some frustrations in that. But the way we did it, we did have to kind of develop the resident impact assessments very quickly, which I think, as Katie rightly pointed out, that isn't ideally how you do this. You should do this really considered, far in advance. But I'll just share kind of what we've learned. And the good thing about doing it in this way is that we've got 2 goes at it. So for each project, we did an initial resident impact assessment. We'll have to do another one, taking into account all of the feedback we get. And I'll show you kind of how that iterative process works a bit. But in some ways, I think there's opportunity in that, because we can really learn and adapt based on the feedback we get from the trial, from people who are impacted with protected characteristics, and make sure we kind of target those people to ensure we hear from them. So just to kind of show how the script's been flipped a bit. So I think the main purpose of Islington's resident impact assessments is to ensure Islington Council's commitment to fairness is translated in practice. Fairness is something we talk about Islington with everything we do, is about fairness. It's kind of a key strand through all of the work the council does. I think the key principles of our resident impact assessment and the way we train officers in our teams to work on them is that they're iterative, so they evolve through the life cycle of the program and the project. They're not perfect. They never will be perfect. We need to continue to learn and develop them as we can. You have to start somewhere, and I think it's important to not make perfection the kind of enemy of good when you do these. And it's better. It's definitely better to have some kind of assessment than to not have one. But how do we make them even better, I think, should be the question. It's a process, not an outcome. So it's not a tick box. I think Katie made some really great points about this and how wrong it can go. You just treat it like a tick box. It's important that it's a process, and that you take the actions and the mitigating outcomes really seriously, and further embed them into the process, and that you use it as a process to help identify issues that you can mitigate either through the design or in other ways. And then also just so important to be transparent. There are positive and negative impacts on almost everything we do. I think acknowledging those is the most important first step to being able to address them. And then, we've spoken kind of about the protected characteristics. Just to add this class here, we call it socioeconomic status in our resident impact assessments, but we include that, and then it's all of the others. And we look at the impacts, positive and negative, on all of these different groups. So for people-friendly streets, we first we had an executive decision to implement the whole program. So we prepared one resident impact assessment. This is kind of the more interesting. It's on a policy, really, less than specific schemes. So that was a more general resident impact assessment. We started to kind of highlight that there were, especially with the low traffic neighborhoods, for people who do drive with very protected characteristics, it did make driving more inconvenient. And then also another negative impact we picked up on was, that if there was displacement onto the main roads, that would be negative. So we kind of started to dig through some of that, but overwhelmingly kind of identified the real benefits to many people with protected characteristics. Like I think Lucy's touched on children, older people, some disabled people, lower income people who might not have access to a car, which are overwhelmingly in London owned by wealthy people. So, we started to kind of pick out some of those impacts, but, we needed to go more in depth for each scheme. We have 7 low traffic neighborhoods. So we did 7 resident impact assessments, all very different, specific to each scheme. And we're now kind of about to publish, really in a few days. So I can't really share too many specifics, but we're going to publish a new executive decision, which needs to be considered by the executive. So it's all proposed. Which has a new, much more robust resident impact assessment. So this is, I think, where kind of the iterative element comes in. We've really improved it at every step. And then we'll make those final decisions on each of the low traffic neighborhoods, informed by this kind of new refreshed resident impact assessment that we've done, but still specific to each scheme. So that's the kind of life cycle. It's quite niche, but I think it does show kind of how with a trial scheme, you can do things at various points, even if you're not front loading the consultation, which I think Mark's pointed out, it's much more difficult with a trial scheme that you have to do quickly, or that, or that you're not doing a consultation on before to tease out all of the impacts. But I still think that's not a good enough excuse to not try, which is what we've done. So our resident impact assessments, I'll definitely throw in the chat a link to them. I think most of ours are kind of come in at around 20 pages. They grow and grow and grow. The structure is we have a summary of the policy, we have a profile of impacted people, and then we go into general positive impacts, specific positive impacts on each protected group, general negative impacts, specific negative impacts, and then most importantly, the action plan, what we're going to do about those negative impacts we've identified. Every negative impact we identify needs to have an action plan. So that's the way ours work. And it's kind of through doing it, you realize what those are. Don't worry about all these numbers. This is just an example from one of ours just to show what that profile is. We kind of try and zone in as far as we can get the data to understand in the specific area for the different protected characteristics, is there kind of over or under representation? So I think looking at this area, so this is just an area in Islington, St Mary's ward, you can see we look at London, Islington, and then the ward. So you can see in this particular area, there's actually quite a low, there's a low proportion of BAME people compared to London more generally, which is interesting, and might, there's not kind of a value in this. I think it's just important to look at this data to know who you're, to know who the people are that you're looking at the impacts of. Some of the other ones, they might be a much higher proportion. So these are all things we kind of look at and consider. And very importantly, in our consultation feedback, this is something we refer back to. Are we getting a representative sample? Are we hearing from the right people? I think, Lucy made some really great points about not hearing from children. We know in this area, 14% of the people under 16, we have 2 responses, consultation responses from people under 16. Do we know what those people think, even though they're quite a significant proportion of the population? So I think really important to do this just as a starting point. It's important to know who the people are. I don't want you to just try and read this. You can read the whole report later at your leisure. Just to kind of give you some snapshots of what these look like for us. So this is for an LTN, Highbury West, Highbury Fields one, general positive impacts. That they reduce the negative impacts of travel, and we identified some specific ones, air quality, road injury, community severance, a specific impact on a specific protected characteristic group. So I looked at age here, older people, we look at older and younger people. So more likely to live with dementia and would benefit from reduced noise pollution, which I'm glad is something I saw Mark pick up in the chat earlier, that we don't talk enough about noise, and it is a very important impact, especially from traffic. Then general negative impacts, so acknowledge that longer routes are more likely to inconvenience some older or disabled residents more than others. And the specific impacts on these groups are set out below. So then in a specific section, we just acknowledge that disabled residents or visitors may rely more on private cars, and that these will be inconvenienced. I think we've stopped, this is from an earlier one, we've stopped using the term inconvenience. I think largely based on feedback we've received in the use of that. I think inconvenience means different things, and there's a value judgment, I think, in using the word inconvenience to describe longer journeys, but for some people, that is life altering. And just do want to really plug Pave the Way report by Transport for All. I think it is an outstanding piece of research that I've read super closely. Everyone on my team's read super closely, and we really look to, and you will see it quoted all over our new impact assessments, because it is that really in-depth research identifying both positive and negative impacts. And yeah, just really plug people to read it. I think it's extremely well researched, and it's a real kind of gold standard of what we should be aspiring to do. So just want to show kind of how the iterative process works for our trials, at least how it's worked, because we have multiple points where we do these assessments. So I'm looking at exemptions, which is something that was recommended in Pave the Way that councils consider. We were considering it before it was mentioned, but do think it's a really important thing to look at the LTNs and consider if exemptions are appropriate. I know many boroughs and local authorities across the country are going through this now. Sorry, when you talk about exemptions, just so people don't spend all day, every day talking about LTNs like me, it's, we have camera enforced modal filters at some of the locations, and they could be used through ANPR technology to exempt people if you chose to. So this is around the policy of informing that. So overall, we identified in the first one, that kind of first RA for the whole program, that there was positive impacts for many vulnerable road users, children, old people, some disabled people. Identified inconvenient journey times, negative impact. Then in the individual ones, identified really specific ones, and that's where we committed to the action to engage around increased journey times with impacted groups as an action. I completely acknowledge in an ideal world we would have done this before implementing the trial. Because of the nature of the trial and because of how quickly COVID happened, we had to do it this way around. We did commit to do it and kind of start. We implemented our first low traffic neighborhood in July 2020, and we're meeting with groups by kind of late September. So it was quite soon that we started meeting with different groups representing disabled people. We met with these groups. We also collected individual feedback, all of our surveys that were online. You could select if you were disabled, and we kind of isolated that feedback to get quite a good snapshot of thousands of responses from disabled people living in Islington, which is obviously invaluable data. So now we have, as I said, this hasn't been formally announced, it will be very soon. We have a new proposed approach for blue badge exemptions, which is informed by this engagement and evidence. I think if we hadn't identified the initial issue in the initial assessment and then, committed to the engagement, we would have not gotten to that point where we would have gotten such detailed feedback. Of course, it's difficult with exemptions, and I think it's a really good example of how complicated these issues are, because of course, there are some disabled people who are benefiting huge amounts from the reduced traffic in the low traffic neighborhoods. And by allowing huge amounts of traffic through the low traffic neighborhoods, Islington has 9,000 blue badge holders, which is a lot of our car owners are blue badge holders. So you kind of have to balance the fact that, someone in a mobility scooter is now able to ride in the middle of the road with no traffic, and that's a really good positive benefit from the reduced traffic. But then someone else who drives and is disabled and their car is their mobility aid, them having to drive a longer trip is having a huge impact on their life. So it's very hard, and this is why these are such difficult things to do, to balance different impacts. But it's about, I think if you're focusing on the right thing, which is people with protected characteristics, if that's what you're focusing on and you're focused on improving it for them, and you're making sure to take into account the variety of views and modes of transport that those groups use, I think that that's the right starting point, but not an answer in itself. And now in the individual schemes RIA, there'll be the new proposed approach to exemptions, which we've kind of developed. Another example that I'll go through a bit more quickly, but someone as part of our kind of engagement with groups came up with the term people-friendly pavements, which we love and have completely adopted. And I think it's kind of, we now have an offshoot of the people-friendly streets program, which is specifically around this idea that we heard from disabled people over and over again, that there were barriers to active travel for them. I think, Wheels for Wellbeing and other organizations have done, Kettle Power have done huge amounts of work to help reduce some of these barriers, but some of them are physical barriers. Some of them are, bollards in the middle of pavements and too narrow pavements and street clutter and lack of tactile paving. And, it's great that we remove all the traffic, but are we really creating an equal space for people to be able to travel actively? Once again, this is also picked up really well in the Paved the Way report. So I think it's something we heard during the engagement that I mentioned. The term was coined for us, which we're going to use going forward. And yeah, removing traffic is not all that's required to enable active travel for some people with protected characteristics. So we needed to do more. So we now kind of are rolling out people-friendly pavements across the borough as part of people-friendly streets to improve the accessibility of pavements where we can, following quite extensive audits. So yeah, it will be incorporated into new schemes going forward. Once again, if we hadn't done the initial assessment, we wouldn't have met with groups, we wouldn't have heard this feedback, and that's why, I think this value shows itself and why it's a living process, not an outcome. So I just want to, I said in the beginning, I'll say it again, like our assessments are not perfect. I, have never seen perfect assessments because I think they can always be improved on, and we should not, we just need to kind of keep improving and keep growing and keep having conversations like this. I think it's really the right starting point. We definitely need more, opportunity for co-production. Katie made this point really well, but also kind of, I think there was a good discussion around some of the challenges of that and consultation fatigue and taking advantage of people's time. And I think especially if you look at a group like disabled people or, within the BAME categories or non-white people, that there are so many different experiences and impacts, and you're never going to get every single person with every protected characteristic in a room to agree on what the right thing is to do. I think it needs to be a balance of research and speaking to people and consultation and engagement, and then just experience. And I think anything you can do to get engineers or transport planners kind of in the streets trying to experience things differently. I think going on site visits with disabled people, like, even that hour, you can learn so much that is applied forward. And I think we need to do more of that. But I also, I just think it's having diverse transport planners and traffic engineers is really it. Like, this is why it's important, because you get those variety of impacts then baked into the schemes. And variety of perspectives. So, it's something I really believe in, and we've worked really hard to diversify our team at Islington. And it's obvious when you do exercises like this why all teams should be. very receptive to feedback on our RAs. Please do tell us how we can improve it. We want to keep improving it. It is iterative. And yeah, trials aren't ideal for RAs and EQIAs. I would say it's much easier if you do a long period of engagement prior to implementation. And as Katie said, start as early as possible. So just, it's about a balanced approach. You have to balance different views. It's, that's what makes it so difficult. Exploring mitigations and what are reasonable adjustments is really important. Being honest and open, where you've missed the mark sometimes, I think is important. And it's where we think transparently about negative impacts. Just a diagram, a helpful reminder that, it's not about just treating everyone equally. It's about reasonable adjustments where we can, make society better. I think social models of disability and vulnerability are, really well explained by the others, so I won't go into it, but something that is obvious, I think, when you start to look at it. Thanks very much. There's my email address if anyone wants to contact me, but I am going to post the links to them. I hope you'll all be waiting to see our announcement about blue badge exemptions, which is coming very soon. But thanks, everyone, and looking forward to questions. And thank you to the other panelists, especially.
Wow. Excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, I'll put in the chat here that anyone who thinks that local authorities don't take this stuff seriously should just tune in for the last 15 minutes of this and just hear the length and depth that you go to in one London borough to try and understand the implications of, let's face it, is a planter in the middle of a road. And we really do take this stuff seriously. We spend a lot of time on it. I did put a small caveat that not every council is as good as yours, which I think is probably a fair point. But okay, so I mean, we've got a few questions in the chat that have come through over the time, but I mean, just maybe very quickly, Katie, it's always a disadvantage going up first because you don't know what other people are going to say. But I mean, are there any sort of broad reflections that you've had from across seeing the other presentations and some of the chat?
Well, thank you both, Lucy and Aya, for your presentations, which were brilliant and so in-depth and so insightful. And yeah, I completely agree, Mark. It's almost a misperception. I think there's a feeling that if you're experiencing an issue with the street space, there is this kind of inclination to sort of blame the council in their kind of faceless abstract sense, but that's not our experience at all. And from working with local authorities, we very much understand that transport planners and urban designers really care and really want to build spaces that are accessible to everyone. And I'm obviously so thrilled to see the kind of learnings from our Pave the Way report be so well understood by people. It's been really humbling and exciting to see. I bang on about pavements all the time. It's like my absolute special interest because I just want everyone to be able to access the pavements and streets and their local area. And low traffic neighborhoods have been tumultuous in terms of inciting passion, shall we say, amongst people, but they have at least kind of shone a light on this issue, which has been neglected for so long, I think. So it's great to see so much progress, I think, in such a short space of time. Yeah,
no, I agree. I do think that the profession has gone through an absolute baptism of fire over the last 18 months on this, but will emerge stronger and better at what we do, I think, at the end of it all. Just sort of pausing on this point of trials, and I spoke at length about the fact that it wasn't ideal, and actually probably will move back to a situation where you do some more upfront consultation. I mean, I'm guessing, Katie, that you would consider that to be a good thing, or have you seen good stuff come out of the trials and your members report back to you?
I think we're in a really good position now where there is significantly more engagement. I think it's tricky. The reason we don't think trials are best practice are because we don't want to see situations in which disabled and vulnerable, Lucy, but I take your point, that is a problematic word to use, but vulnerable pedestrians are used as sort of not guinea pigs, live testers of schemes that may have a not just negative impact, but kind of a safety impact. Thinking, I mean, there's been some examples recently. You may have seen a kind of our own letter, and also a letter from the Access Association about colourful crossings, so painting artistic patterns on the roads. And there have been significant concerns raised about the kind of safety implications of those, particularly for people with various cognitive impairments, people affected by dementia, and a likelihood of falling in roads. And I think for me, it's sort of there wouldn't ever be a position where, or I hope there wouldn't be a position where non-disabled people are expected to kind of live test new schemes without robust processes to ensure that there aren't any safety implications of these schemes. Whereas for some reason, when it comes to accessibility and safety are obviously very linked, trials are introduced where you have these situations where it's like, well, let's get some disabled people down to kind of see the area and see what they think, even though that area might be causing harm or discomfort or stress or whatever to particular disabled people. So that's why we've never advocate for trials. However, we understand that in many situations it is simply impossible, especially with the kind of COVID situation. It has been impossible to have this lengthy, detailed engagement process in the lead up. I think so long as that engagement is ongoing and thorough and inclusive, and the learnings are kind of implemented in a rolling way. If you identify an issue and you can go and do something about it kind of immediately without having to wait till the end of the particular trial. I think so long as it's like really reactive, then I think it can be made to work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Lucy, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I take your point, Katie, about the kind of the problem in a sense with live trials, that potentially you're putting people at risk in a live way. This is real traffic, but on the other side of things, there have been major increases in traffic occurring over the past few decades without any consultation at all. So although the road infrastructure, the physical road hasn't changed, we've seen huge increases, particularly in residential roads, side roads, 40% increases or 50% increases on some London roads, on side roads, over the last 10 years. So quite a short time frame, and none of that was consulted on. So I think there are issues obviously with live trials. I think there are some advantages as well. I know, having sort of heard Sarah Berry talk and spoken to Sarah Berry, that actually it's easier to galvanise support for low traffic neighbourhoods if people can see what actually happens, that the sky doesn't necessarily fall in. It may, but there may be problems with it. It may need amending, it may need changing, but only for a lot of people, they will only really understand what less traffic means once they see it, as they did in COVID, and as they have done with some of these trials. On the issue of casualties, there is more evidence coming out now about low traffic neighbourhoods, that they do reduce casualties significantly, and that they have a much more significant impact at reducing casualties than things like 20-mile-an-hour zones and traffic calming schemes. But that doesn't necessarily mean people feel safer. So that's maybe some of the differences that are coming out in your research there. But I think we do need potentially more evidence on some of these things. But there's the physical infrastructure, and then there's just lots of traffic occurring and appearing on our streets in a way that there's been no consultation and asking the public whether they fancy that or not. It's just happened. So.
No, that's a really good point. Aya, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think it's such an important debate to be having about the use of trials in transport planning. I think I completely, agree with what Lucy's saying, just in that I think, and people just have a resistance to change. And I think people's just general resistance to change isn't a good enough reason to not implement policies that there is a big support for. I think we're all aware of climate change. We're all concerned about it. We all are, every person that dies on any streets in England is one person too many. And I think, we all know we want to do these things. But, when it comes down to actually doing stuff, there is just resistance to change and inertia. And I think trials help to overcome some of that. That being said, I think there's different ways to do an engagement and consultation. I know, and I can speak for Islington, we don't view consultation engagement as a referendum where there's a majority voice that, gets to make support. And then that's what happens, because the response rates to consultations are not high enough for us to be able to make decisions based on what 5% of people have said for 100% of people. And that being said, it's not that anyone's voice matters more than anyone else's, but I think in our consultation reports, we really strive to kind of spotlight underrepresented voices and, people with predicted characteristics. I think, even though in our consultation feedback on the LTMs, there aren't that many comments about adding drop curves, but any comment about adding drop curve is extremely important, because it's as part of people-friendly payments, it's removing that barrier to active travel for someone. And even though, disabled people are a minority of the population, different figures depending on which disabilities you're looking at, but that doesn't mean that their voices should just be averaged out. Because footways wasn't, because drop curves was kind of only mentioned once, it's not important. I think you have to really zone in. I think the same with kind of all the protected characteristics. So I think it's about, and I think what Katie's talking about is like, when you implement something or you just share it with the right group of people, you can pick out early impacts and then fix the scheme in that way, which is very different to saying, do you want an LTN, yes or no? But more, we want to reduce traffic. We want to achieve, this carbon reduction that we're striving for. Help us design a scheme that will work for this area that will still achieve that. And then you don't end up in situations where you're removing dedicated disabled days, or you're, inadvertently, just because you didn't ask and you didn't check. So I think there's ways to do it in which it's consultations feeding into the design and improving the design rather than vetoing a design. And so that to me is kind of my view on still trials. You're still going to try it, you commit to trialing it, but you engage before.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. We talked about this actually in our last session about general community engagement, and exactly the same thing applies, I think, here, is that so much of it is down to trust. People are prepared to see trials happen if they trust that the council will make changes in response to legitimate concerns. And, some councils have that trust, and they've spent a huge amount of time investing in the civic infrastructure necessary to gain that trust. Other councils don't, and that really has gone to the heart of it. So you put a trial in, and you immediately get the cynicism. Well, it's already a done deal. It's sorted. You're not going to change anything. It's done. And I think overcoming that is the key to making trials a successful tool, because if you can't, then you're kind of on a losing wicket. There's quite a few just specifically on that point. Your disabled blue badge eligibility scheme, which I know a few other boroughs have done. Did you want to just touch a little bit more on how that's going to work, or is it still, are you in the midst of finalising it and don't want to go into the detail?
It's still proposed. I would say that kind of like with every decision we make at Islington, it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative data that we look at to feed into that. So hearing, pieces of research like Pave the Way, but also what we've heard directly from disabled people and from groups representing disabled people have fed into that decision through a multitude of ways. And I think for us, our resident impact assessment, which will be available very shortly, has a balanced view. I think it's fair to say that we want to protect the integrity of the low traffic neighbourhoods if they are to remain permanently at the end of the trial. And allowing large amounts of traffic through a low traffic neighborhood would mean it wouldn't be a low traffic neighborhood anymore. But I think we're in a position now where we recognize that the scheme has unintended impacts on people who need to drive and who's for them their car is the mobility aid. And I think it's not even about needing to drive. It's about the fact that you may have a longer journey, and longer journeys for some disabled people for who walking is more of the chat is the kind of more related to their disability. Being in a car for 5 minutes longer doesn't make a big difference, but for some people that's a life altering change, being in the car 5 minutes longer. So we're really getting that input back, and that has helped inform our exemption policy, which is limited. I would say it's not kind of a completely open blanket exemption. It's limited, and different boroughs are limiting it in a different way to protect the integrity of the scheme, to ensure that it doesn't infringe on other vulnerable road users or other protected characteristics' ability to enjoy low traffic neighborhoods and kind of benefit from them. So I can't say more, but it's very interesting to see, like Ealing before they moved their low traffic neighborhoods, did a kind of area wide thing. Hackney are only doing their B roads, so only their B roads have blue badge exemptions. other boroughs or their blue badge users have had exemptions. So there is a variety of different things being proposed, and I think that shows the different communities in these areas and what they come to. It always needs to be iterative, and you just need to keep assessing and learning and see if it's working. But yeah, we will be announcing it very soon, so you can all look out for the news.
No, that's good. I mean, just in respect to the specific sort of technique of it all, I mean, the different boroughs have used different techniques, but typically you turn the area into an authorised vehicle only area, and only blue badges are permitted to go into the area. And blue badge owners who live in the area can register and essentially get themselves on a dispensation or whitelist often, so that they can go through the closure, which is enforced via ANPR. So you know that in some ways that can be quite a neat and elegant way of dealing with some of the concerns that get raised in the equalities impact assessments. But as somebody once told me, that I've never seen anybody play cricket in front of a flying motorbike sign, whereas of course they do play cricket in front of a bollard or whatever. So you know, and then you're back into trading off against other users. So I think it is about that craft. I mean, we've had lots of questions in about that, about how we trade off against the needs of different people. And I think, Katie, your point about the sort of pan disability approach was really helpful. I mean, I remember the shared space wars of the last decade, and you know, that was very much engineers being told, oh well, you know, shared space is a great idea because we get rid of all these trip hazards, these horrible curbs, and then somebody says, oh, actually they're awful because you know you introduce terrible environment for people visually impaired, but wheelchair users love them, and eventually people just sort of said, well, we won't do any of that then because nobody seems to agree. And I think taking a pan disability approach is the way forward on that. Would that be your perception as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's well understood within the disability community that different people have different needs, and those needs are sometimes in conflict with one another. Tactile paving being a perfect example. You know, going over it in a wheelchair is really unpleasant, but I understand obviously that's there, which is a crucial safety measure for my visually impaired friends and colleagues. And it's getting that. I mean, the City of London have recently done a brilliant project. It's something called it's COLSAT, City of London Street Accessibility Tool, which is it's sort of this matrix system of looking at all of these different specific examples of street space, whether that be a particular curb or a dropped curb or a blister paving or whatever it is. And then they have conducted all of these qualitative interviews with disabled people across the impairment groups and kind of got them to rate how much of an inconvenience that specific thing is, and then develop this sort of matrix spreadsheet which sort of tells you, okay, we can do this, which mitigates that impact, but kind of causes a bit of an inconvenience over here, but that's not that much of an inconvenience. And it's very clever. But I mean, obviously that's incredibly technical and numerical, but I think it's more about bringing those people together, having those conversations, and coming up with a specific street space design that inconveniences people the least. And to take your point on shared space, I mean, shared space there must be some tactile delineation between the footway and the cycle lane or the road. That's a safety thing, and I think safety, a visually impaired person's safety comes before my sort of like wobbly wheelchair experience.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I mean, I had a session with the City of London as part of the sort of group of London boroughs, and they had done some really interesting stuff in this space. And I think actually there's a lot of transferable best practice from what they've done from that tool. But also they have a sort of standing panel of experts from across the different protected characteristics that they can call upon, and pan disability as well, that they can call upon to very quickly, rapidly assess schemes, which meant that they were going into these trials with genuine grade A comment on it. It wasn't just somebody trying to put themselves in other people's shoes, which I thought was really good, and I believe they pay them as well, which is even better. And the equalities impact assessment approach that they've taken is much more like a risk assessment. So they try and score these different things, exactly as you just said, Katie. And that seems to me to be a very fruitful area of understanding how you trade off against different things, with safety coming absolutely at the top, and then sort of working down from that. Go on, Katie. Yeah.
Sorry, just another thing. Yeah. Obviously, we understand now a lot better than perhaps a year and a half ago that disabled is not synonymous with blue badge holders, and disabled is not synonymous with disabled motorists. And it's understanding that yes, it's important that disabled motorists are not too inconvenienced. However, it's also really important to ensure that those disabled people who were enabled to make active travel journeys by low traffic neighborhoods, visually impaired people having more confidence to walk around their local neighborhoods without fear of being hit by a car. That's a huge, brilliant access progress, and it's ensuring that you don't start to reel that back in by providing just for disabled motorists. So there are trade-offs to be had, and that's why these conversations are really important.
Yes, yeah. Someone says balance the needs of all road users is a bit of a red flag for some people, so we need to be a bit careful of that. But
I think just kind of responding to that, I think something that I always think about when me and my team are kind of discussing raising impact assessments and how we can improve them is, I'm sure many of you know it's the story around the vegetable peeler, and the fact that like the vegetable peeler that most of us use today is this really thick ergonomic handle. But the kind of early vegetable peelers were just like really pieces of metal that would just dig into your hand if you were peeling lots of potatoes. And what they ended up doing is the reason we got to our design is because they designed a vegetable peeler for people with arthritis. And in doing that, they made something that was so much better for everyone to use, because why would you not want to use a big, squishy, nice vegetable peeler and instead use a metal one that digs into your hand? And for me, that's what it's about. That's why this is such a fundamental part of the job, because if you design something that works for kind of people on the extremities who have very specific needs, you often make it better for everyone. I think bus stop bypasses, which are another one where, these conversations about trade-off becomes huge, and for some disabled people who cycle, it's great to have a protected cycle lane, but for, other disabled people or older people who are slow to walk, crossing over a cycle lane can be extremely challenging to get to a bus stop island. But if you design a bus stop bypass that is well designed, it has a large island, it's got very clear crossings, it's got ample space for people on both sides to be able to stand and wait, it's got good visibility. And if you do that with kind of a person with mobility challenges in mind, or someone who's slightly slower crossing the street in mind, you make it better for everyone else who has to use it. And I think that it's, that's the important thing. It's kind of, if you design a street like purely from a child's perspective, it will guaranteed be a street that everyone else likes to be on more. And that's why I think, and I think just to Mark's point, I think a panel is such a good idea for this, and I think that's something we're looking at doing, and more boroughs I think are doing, and considering panels that are paid for, that you have people represented. I think the hard thing is it's tough to know where to start, because as soon as you make that panel, you'll be criticized because someone in Islington's unique perspective will not be represented on it, and there's tension involved in that. But this is where I think it's much better that local authorities try and attempt to do something, with good intentions, and listen to the feedback when it's given, but not be paralyzed. But, I like having seen kind of what's happened with the policies impact assessments over the last year and kind of all the challenges, I can see why transport planners are just so terrified of them and just don't even want to get anywhere near them, and just put it off until it's too late. Yeah. But I just think it's not good enough, because I think we will just have better schemes if we design for kind of the most vulnerable people and the people with the most specific needs. It will just often end up kind of benefiting everyone.
Absolutely, yes. No, my team will tell you I love an analogy, so I'll be nicking that vegetable peeler one. It's brilliant. Lucy.
Yeah, I just well, first of all, I wanted to say to Aya that it's brilliant to hear such a thoughtful, kind of thorough approach, I think. I very much hope there's some sort of sharing of best practice between authorities, because I'm sure there are a lot of other boroughs who could learn a lot from your approach. But yeah, I wondered also whether it is quite hard to know where to stop, isn't it? Because I think we've sort of realised that there aren't homogenous groups of, there isn't one voice for disabled people and one voice for children, and you do have to stop somewhere. But I thought it was quite heartening that actually that ruling about the Bishopsgate thing, the judges ruled in the end that it was reasonable and sensible, and generally seemed a fairly common sense, reasonably thoughtful EQIA. It wasn't perfect, but I think that should give authorities courage really to just really do their best, think about these different groups, and not be too, nothing's going to be perfect. You've got however many people in the borough and there'll be that many different views on it. So you can't, clearly you can't do something for everybody, but there's going to be, you've got to stop somewhere and take a view. And I think that the ruling kind of acknowledged that. Yeah, I'm also very uncomfortable with the term shared space, but I think that's another discussion completely. So
I think we all are. I'm certainly bruised by it. Okay, that absolutely excellent. Thank you guys. Really loads of really good feedback in the chat. So I think a useful and enjoyable evening for everybody. Any final reflections from panelists? Anything that you particularly want to get in there before we draw the event to a close?
Sorry, I mean, the one thing I also think about too is just how different, it's kind of like my vegetable peel example. It's something I bang on about, but just as about, that, yeah, a street that's better for a wheelchair user is so much better for everyone who's lugging a suitcase, which is going to be someone, all of us at any point. And I, do get my team out there with suitcases, the big heavy suitcases that need to pull them and be like, well, where is the drop curve? It's nowhere. And this is what the problem is. So I think that I just think there's so many tools and techniques. And I think to Lucy's point, it's just very important that we kind of keep having these conversations and keep talking and learning from each other, not try and kind of reinvent the wheel every time, because, there's great research out there and there's real experts in this stuff. So Thank you very much to my co-panelists. I've learned so much today. So thanks, and thanks, Mark, and everyone for organizing.
Absolute pleasure. Katie, anything final from you?
Likewise, thank you, I and Lucy. Such brilliant presentations, and it's been such a joy to present with you. And just wanted to kind of hammer home the point about designing for accessibility and EQIAs being a positive thing to enable more people to do more things. I think so often they're seen as trying to avoid the worst possible outcome and trying to avoid the negatives, but I think to view them as something to make good decisions to enable more people to access their local communities, and just enabling more people to navigate their local areas, which we all agree with. So that's good. And thank you.
Excellent. And Lucy, I think you've done your summing up, but did you have any final comments?
No, sorry, I unmuted, but yeah, no, pleasure to hear the talk. I've learned a lot. So thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you all of our attendees today. I think this has actually been the one where people have stayed for the longest. I think we had 80 or so at the beginning, almost 90, in fact, that joined us at one stage. And pretty much everyone stayed right until the very end. So that's absolutely fabulous, and a testament to three brilliant presentations and good discussion as well. So yeah, I've just popped in the chat actually our next one of our Transport Planning Day events, which is actually going to be co-chaired with CILT, Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport's Accessibility Panel, and that's Jim Morray, who's actually in the audience today, who's also a TPS board member, and looking at some tensions between equality considerations and sustainability. So we have this climate emergency. It's an emergency. So how much do we need to do stuff that we wouldn't do normally, and what implications does that have across these different issues? So I think it will be an interesting one. Probably touch on some of the points that we've heard here today as well. So yeah, please come along to that, and also to our Transport Planning Day event itself on the 15th. And of course, if you are in the industry, Transport Planning Day is your day. Please do organise events. Please do organise, well, pretty much anything actually. We've got blogs, we've got quizzes, we've got photo competitions, anything where we can celebrate being a transport planner and maybe reflecting on what it means to be a transport planner after 18 months of pretty tumultuous events. In fact, it's never been a more interesting and sort of slightly more daunting industry, I would say. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Brogan, for the support, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Cheers.